Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Bristol Neuroscience webinar, which has snuck rather sneakily into the time slot of the Physiology, Pharmacology and Neuroscience seminars. But it's worth it because today we'll be living the translational dream. We have a talented doubled act on stage this afternoon. First up, we have Professor Candy McCabe, who is Clinical Chair of Nursing at the University of West of England. And has done a range of fascinating work in chronic pain conditions. I've heard a talk before about phantom limb pain and things like that. So I'm looking forward very much to hearing about what's going on in the pain health integration team in the region. And then Candy will be followed by Professor Tony Pickering, who'll be dancing the translational dance between rodent and human and sort of setting some more mechanistic work in Candy's context, I guess. So first up, Candy, thanks very much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing a HIT update.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you. That's great. I'm just opening up the presentation. Okay.
Looks good.
Great. Perfect. Thank you very much for this great opportunity. It's so lovely just to be able to talk to people in this strange time. So as you can see here, today I'm the director of the Chronic Pain Health Integration Team. I also have a couple of other roles in relation to research at UWE Bristol, and I'm head of research at Dorothy House Hospice in Winsley. And you'll see that actually those roles have come in somewhat into our work of the chronic pain HIT. I've gone for the real basics in this presentation, just to explain a bit more about health integration teams per se, and apologies, many of you may be very familiar with Bristol Health Partners, but I often speak to clinicians and academics who say, I don't quite understand what goes on with Bristol Health Partners, so I thought it may be helpful just to do an introductory slide a little bit about the background to Bristol Health Partners and health integration teams more widely. So what and who are Bristol Health Partners? And they are this strategic collaboration between the city's major healthcare areas and social care, and they cover the Bristol, North Somerset and South Gloucestershire area. And of course, we've got three large and very vibrant trusts within that area, and there's also the Clinical Commissioning Group, 2 universities, Bristol City Council. So many partners are involved in the Bristol Health Partners. Their work is really about integrating, bringing together these communities for research, innovation, clinical practice and education. But the sole purpose really is to improve the local public health offering and that healthcare delivery. And that is very much about partnership working, so working with the general public, health, social care and academia. And to help support that, they created these health integration teams. And the health integration teams really are microcosms of Bristol Health Partners. So they have all of the same partners within them, as does the wider organisation. And they have evolved in lots of different areas, sometimes very specific areas, such as perhaps stroke, or perhaps a more cross-cutting area, such as the management of incontinence. And the chronic pain health integration team is one of those more cross-cutting teams. Who is going to benefit from our activities? And this is really as wide as the partnership within those HITs. So of course, the key focus is on patients, carers and their families in our region, but also community groups and the general public within those areas. And then we always hope that we will make sure that we'll bring in the health and social care providers and professionals. Commissioners have been crucial, and over the time that I've worked with the chronic pain HIT, that commissioning lobbying has been really important. And of course, commissioning has changed considerably over the last 10 to 15 years as well. So it's always a matter of making sure that you are abreast with who the influencers are within the community. Around the Bristol area, we're really fortunate to have so many voluntary sector organisations who really make a substantial difference to our community's health. So they are crucial partners. as of course keeping in mind policy bodies, local government and other health and social care regulators. And this gets translated into the work streams that many of the health integration teams have. And they may be looking at improving clinical pathways, both in efficiency and access, patient education, health professional education, and then importantly for this particular group, about clinical research and how that feeds into informing the work, but also how the clinical puzzlements or social care challenges move up from the grassroots up to informing the research agenda. And then crucially, if we're really successful, we start to influence policy. And that may be just in the local area, but ideally through working with academic health science networks, through the ARCs, we can start to influence national policy. Chronic pain, as you will all be very familiar with, is a significant challenge. And our latest data set tells us that somewhere between a third and a half of the UK population are experiencing chronic pain. So this is a large group. And if you think about the number of people in our region, this really is a significant factor that either that's their primary problem or it's a secondary comorbidity. Musculoskeletal pain is the most common, with chronic low back pain being the primary complaint that takes people to their GPs. And as you'll all be aware, chronic pain affects all aspects of life. So mood, function, whether people are working or not, whether they're being able to conduct their family roles, and of course their relationships. And I always think that chronic pain doesn't just happen to the individual experiencing it, but it also affects all of those people who they're integrating with. By the nature of having an aging population, we are going to have more individuals living a longer life with other major chronic disabling conditions, and the incidence of chronic pain within that will always be high. So the need for addressing chronic pain in our population remains significant. In 2020, so just last year, the World Health Organization and the International Association for Study of Pain published a new classification for chronic pain. And although this is rather a dry and perhaps unexciting area, for the world of chronic pain, this can make a significant difference. Because until that point, we didn't have classifications that we could put against our patient's diagnosis and say, actually, this is the classification for this particular chronic pain. And by having conditions classified, it means that then they get registered into the appropriate primary, secondary care, data collecting processes, and also costed appropriately. And so for the world of chronic pain, this is a huge step forward. And it means that for example, the most recent NICE guidance, which has been on primary chronic pain, we can define what do we mean by these different types of chronic pain and what needs do individuals who have those particular chronic pains, what do they need and what sort of services do we need? Often people may have more than one of these categories, and that is entirely relevant and common. So this, for the world of chronic pain, although, as I say, unexciting, actually gives us a lot of opportunities to make our services run more smoothly, but also for us to have more transparency about the complexity of the patients that we're caring for. The Chronic Pain Health Integration Team was established in 2014, but originally it was called the Integrated Pain Management Health Integration Team. And just last year, we changed the title to Chronic Pain. This is just a snapshot of our website on the Bristol Health Partners website. And you can see that our ambition is that everyone living with chronic pain in our community has access to the support they need. And rather unusually for health integration teams, our particular health integration team covers Bristol and Bath. Often they're just located to the BNSSG area, but we're really fortunate in our geographical region that we have significant national and international expertise in both Bristol and Bath. So it seemed entirely sensible when we started out on this journey that we brought together the best that we have within our region and not be restricted by the boundaries of Bristol Health Partners. In recent years, the HITs have been able to call on a little bit more funding than they used to be able to do from Bristol Health Partners. So we now have a part-time project manager who works half a day a week, who's Dr. Alison Llewellyn, and we have a part-time administrator who again works half a day a week for the HIT. And this is actually quite significant progress for the HITs. And we're also able to bid once a year for project funding, usually up to a maximum of about 20,000, which is done on a competitive basis, but gives us the opportunity to host meetings, or in these more recent times to conduct surveys and just do work that helps to initiate other opportunities to bring in other funding. I thought it may be helpful just to go into a bit of detail about exactly what our HIT aspires to do, and this will give you an indication of the sort of work that we do. So we really want to make sure that across our region, we have a shared delivery model for pain, and therefore by using the new WHO ICD diagnostic criteria, it means that we can get a feel for who are the populations that we're seeing, what degree of complexity they have, what services are being delivered for all those different diagnostic groups of patients. So immensely helpful to us. And that is work that we're hoping to push forward in the next year or so. First of all, to do a survey to see exactly how it is currently used, how that criteria is now being used within our practices, but also how we can promote its use more actively. We as well, having listened to our community, it was very clear that there's a significant problem with accessing evidence-based information about chronic pain. And that's both from the patient's perspective or somebody newly diagnosed with chronic pain, but also through to the care deliverers, so such as GPs and through to the social care, in just knowing what resources are out there and how to have difficult conversations that you may not actually be able to give any more treatment. These are long-term conditions, and where to find excellent self-management information. And we were also aware that there's a huge amount of international leading research that goes on in our region, but often those people working in Bristol have no idea what those in Bath are doing, or in vice versa. So we wanted to be able to more transparently share that expertise so that our local populations can benefit from that local work. And as part of that, we wanted to make sure that we brought together all of the research that's going on so that we can talk as a group much more coherently and transparently about that work and how it's impacting our local community. And finally, we hoped that by bringing together all of this information, we can start to influence our commissioners and policymakers by having a clear messaging about what goes on in our community for people with chronic pain. And it's only by communicating that as a collective group that we think will have the maximum impact. Bristol Health Partners are absolutely appropriately very keen to ensure that we have diversity and inclusivity across all of our working. And that's something that we're proactively starting to address. So working with hard to reach communities, working with populations who have had significant expertise about how to ensure that things aren't just tokenistic and that we really are being as inclusive as we can be and reaching all those hard to reach groups. And that's work that we're still learning from the team at Bristol Health Partners from. So in terms of what we've been doing just in the last year, and I'll tell you a little bit more detail about a couple of those projects, is that there was already a pre-existing project between the clinical teams across the BNSSG region and the commissioning groups about integrating chronic pain and musculoskeletal services. And that has been a huge piece of work, which is still ongoing. But really, we wanted to make sure that there was a clear, transparent pathway so that people who are entering those systems have a single route, and we can describe at any one point what outcome measures we're collecting, who is appropriate for them to be seen, and we're more efficiently managing that resource. Due to the impact of COVID-19 as well, we wanted to really understand what had happened to pain services, and I'll give you a little bit more information about that survey. And as part of that, we wanted to start to identify and start to address pain inequalities, such as access to pain services. We as well wanted to understand what the health needs were within our community so that we could inform what the content should be of our proposed resource centre. And what we had the opportunity for was to develop a pilot resource centre based around palliative end-of-life care. And that was in part due to our connections with Dorothy House Hospice and their fantastic marketing team. And they've very kindly agreed to work with us so that we can do a resource hub to improve access for patients and healthcare professionals about how to manage chronic pain in the palliative care setting. I'll also tell you a little bit more about that as we come through. So we've hosted a stakeholder event to help inform that, and have again looked at the data from our COVID-19 survey to identify what educational needs our workforce might need to address the new ways of working. As part of the health integration team, we work really closely with the patient and public, and we are able to facilitate our members to have access to that PPI group so that while they're completing grant applications, they can ask questions of that group and help inform the design and perhaps the protocol design of that future bid. And so we've done that for a number of large bids over the last year. And that's a really enjoyable piece of work that we can offer to our members. And we also wanted to make sure that we are communicating and collaborating across our membership. So we're updating our website, we're making sure that we're engaging with our membership so that we're not some distant group, but we're really listening to people at the grassroots so that we can look to see what are the emerging needs. And one of those emerging needs was in terms of long COVID and the impact of chronic pain in that setting. And so that's something we've picked up this year that was unplanned for, but was very much something that the community said we need to be exploring. So just very briefly, I'll tell you about two of those projects. So one of those was the electronic survey that we conducted with healthcare professionals who were providing care through their chronic pain services at the middle of last year. And we went to healthcare professionals specifically rather than to patients, simply because we wanted to do something really quickly, and it didn't require us to have ethical approval. We could just go to the healthcare professional members within the HIT. And we gave an electronic survey and put that out across the Bristol and Bath region. And we're just amazed that anybody responded to it when things were so busy clinically. But we were really pleased that we had a good cross-section of responses from across the healthcare service delivery teams. And you can see the sort of questions we asked. So we were interested to know how services had changed, and from a healthcare professional perspective, what they thought were the advantages, disadvantages of that, both from their perspective, but also perhaps inferred perspective of their patients as well, and what had impacted patient care. And we were also interested to know whether actually some of these altered practices, whether people were going to continue with them, whether they thought that actually there were benefits they'd like to keep. And we as well wanted to report about how they were implementing this care and how there was support given through that different type of care. And this work was conducted by our project manager, who's Dr. Alison Llewellyn. And so she conducted the survey and analysed the data for us. And very briefly, this was what came back from those responses. There was very definitely a risk to increasing health inequality in terms of chronic pain. So for those people who may be on lower incomes or just did not have access to the IT, either through not having good networks or even, just simply not having a computer where they could engage with the clinical service, then that was a significant problem. For non-English speakers, it was an issue, or for those who had learning disabilities, then it wasn't so easy to be communicating via online systems. Again, age was a bit of a factor, and that wasn't always that it was, perhaps older populations who didn't use these devices. That wasn't the case at all. And in fact, it was very interesting to see how age varied across the community, but age was definitely a factor that may interfere with communication. There were other things around communication challenges. So there were some people who said, normally I'd have brought my partner and we'd have had a conversation here together. And actually it was really helpful that the partner was just sitting next to me, versus other people who said, actually I was having to conduct this conversation in the middle of a very busy household. I didn't have the privacy that I wanted. I couldn't ask and talk about the things that normally I'd like to have done just in a private space. And then there were other people who had full-time care and responsibilities who just couldn't get away to have that conversation. And they said, normally, if I was going to the hospital, I've arranged for someone to come and sit with the person I'm caring for, and I'd have had that day out, but I can't do that now. And then, of course, there's always the flip side. So many people with chronic pain find it incredibly difficult to attend clinical appointments. Often, they're morning appointments, and people with chronic pain quite commonly have a time in the day when it's easier, it's better for them to be moving and traveling. And now they could pick and choose much more. And in fact, the DNA rate for patient appointments went down dramatically because people were at home and were available. Also, people with chronic pain weren't having to pay to travel or weren't having to use public transport, again, an expensive resource. They felt that it was more acceptable to them because they could time it better at when it was convenient to them, and they could perhaps involve people more who wouldn't normally be able to accompany them. It also gave them choices about whether they wish to continue this online or whether they wish to come in face-to-face at a later date. And certainly from the clinicians and the patient's perspective, there was a feeling that actually this is a good thing and something where we may want to offer this in the future in order to give this greater flexibility and choice. And then my last bit I just want to cover is about the work we're doing around the Chronic Pain Resource Hub. So we're aware that there are already information sharing systems that operate in Bristol. And for those people working in primary care, Remedy is a fantastic resource, which is primarily available to GPs and has a huge amount of information on it about patient care, nice guidelines, local pathways. But it is only available to primary care. It's not available to the wider workforce. And our HIT as well covers the Bath area, and it's not a resource we have available in Bath or anything similar. There's the Wellspring Living Centre, which many of you may well know, which is based in Bristol area. And this is a drop-in area for people with any range of conditions, has information resources there, as well as exercise classes. So again, a really great source of us being able to share information, but only accessible to a certain group of population. So in our stakeholder event in 2020, we conducted online workshops to really explore what our community needed in terms of resources to improve clinical practice and education for healthcare professionals, but also what did our patients and the general public want, and how could we share our resources about research. And then we've been working with the marketing team at Dorothy House in order to look at a micro version of this aspiration, which will be a much bigger chronic pain resource hub, by looking at it specifically for chronic pain in palliative care. We're very aware that what we don't want to do is create yet another website that has endless resource links that we're going to be having to be constantly updating. So what we want to do is something that is a clear, uncluttered approach, which gives specific information that is timely, that's appropriate, and isn't overlapping with other providers. So what we've come up with is that the most helpful things people feel is to have some videos and then a fact sheet that accompanies that video. And initially these were based around topics that we've called Let's Talk About. And we've got one specifically about pain, but we've also got topics which are influenced and affected by pain. So movement, sleep, and mood. And we wanted to create one that's presented by a healthcare professional aimed at healthcare professionals, and then one that's presented by a patient and aimed at the patient group in each of those categories. And for example, the healthcare professional one, often people said that we just need an exemplar of how to hold a difficult conversation. That's what we want. And so we have a lot of expertise from our tertiary pain services who are managing on a daily basis some really complex patients and having to say, actually, there's nothing we can offer. And GPs were telling us, we need that information. We need to know how to broach those conversations. So again, bringing in our colleagues from palliative care as well, we will host a workshop with our palliative care consultants and allied healthcare professionals and nursing teams so that we can tailor this specifically to their particular needs. And we hope to have that up and running later this year. So I hope that's been helpful to give you an insight into Bristol Health Partners, the working of HITs. There are a huge number of HITs out there, undoubtedly something for everybody. And we do a lot of cross-HIT working. So the chronic pain HIT does a lot of work with the older people's HIT. And we're also hopeful that there will be an end-of-life care and palliative care HIT that will grow up later this year, who I'm certain will have a close relationship with too. We're always really keen to have new members. And even if you just want to be a silent member that sits there and receives our weekly updates, then you're most welcome. But equally, we're really happy to have people who want to get engaged and be working with us. So please do note down the contact details and come and join us. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Candy. You're dead right. It is quite difficult for an academic researcher like myself, for instance, to navigate all these HITs. There are over 20, I think, in Bristol Health Partners. So it's really useful to get that clear explanation of what you're up to. And it's great that the HITs are working together because there's so many obvious ways that could happen as well. Do let us know if there's anything Bristol Neuroscience can ever do for your HIT. Speaking of which, a Bristol neuroscientist is up next. So I think we'll hand over to Tony now, and then we could cover any broader questions at the end. Professor Pickering, are you out there? There he is. Thanks again, Candy, very much. We'll plague you at the end with some questions. Tony just has to decide which of his half a dozen screens to share.
Cool. Can you see that?
Yep, that's the one. Thank you.
Oh, good. Thanks, Matt. And thanks, Candy, for a really nice intro, actually, to the topic. And I'm going to try and take on with a more, stepping back a little bit from the actual delivery end, which is where Candy sits, that important interface with patients, towards how we shift some science towards patients. That's really what this talks about, and it's a bit of a to and fro with translation. Those are the people that fund our work, and just to say that I will be talking about the consultancy and clinical trial that we've been doing. So this, I've been paid for that, for my consultancy work, so just bear that in mind. So Candy's introduced the problem. I'll not labor it, but there's a lot of pain around and our treatments are poor. The current drugs have limited efficacy and many have prominent side effects, and actually society is increasingly intolerant of those side effects. And therefore there's a need to try to restock the pipeline in terms of different treatment approaches. And we have a patient population that are looking to us for solutions. And this, of course, means translation from basic science to clinical application. And this is a two-way street, but that's a difficult to dance to do, as Matt has alluded to. This heading in two directions simultaneously is a challenge for most creatures. In Bristol, we're fortunate, though, that we have a long tradition of pain research, which has run down a largely electrophysiological line. And this is the current brood of people who are actually delivering on this research agenda. And I'll be mentioning their work as I go through. What do we do? Well, we do rodent research, electrophysiology, and cellular manipulations of specific circuits to assess the impact on behavior and to do mechanistic investigations. We also do increasingly human proof of concept studies to see whether the mechanisms that we're dealing with in rodents are in any way evident in either patients or healthy volunteers. And that's essentially experimental medicine studies. And we also get involved in some clinical trials now of novel therapeutic approaches. So I'll start with a story from way back when I was just finishing off as a trainee in anesthetics. I'm a clinician, and I was involved in recruiting patients into a study. And this is the back of a delightful lady who was then 89 with postherpetic neuralgia, a painful neuropathic pain condition that starts from a shingles attack. And the shingles attack had occurred 16 years earlier. And this lady who had spent 15 years of her life in Greenland as a Christian missionary, and so was familiar with hardship and deprivation, said that this was the worst thing that had happened to her in her life, because this pain had persisted unabated for 16 years without any of the treatments making any impact. And she said it ruined her life. Well, this, of course, makes a big impact on a young clinician. And this lady's story has stuck in my mind ever since. The study we were doing was to test a mechanism that had been proposed by Fernando Severo and Jenny Laird for coupling between sensory neurons and release of vasoactive substances in the skin, which might produce a flare, change in skin blood flow that we could detect with this machine. So we tormented the patients to see whether, when we brushed their skin with a cotton bud, whether that was produced the change in skin blood flow. It's an interesting idea with some supportive animal research. Punchline, yeah, we couldn't find any change in skin blood flow. We did manage to put our lady on the cover of Pain. That negative study was published, but it was an interesting experience for me, because we had to work hard to do this study and ended up with empty hands. Shame for us, shame for our patients, shame for GlaxoSmithKline. But this general idea of how do we prevent an acute pain, such as shingles, turning into chronic pain with sensitization that lasts out for years, is obviously an important question for our research. And I'll return to that later in the talk. So it's fair to say that under the appropriate behavioral circumstance, we can all suppress pain because it's more important that we prioritize another activity. And pain is a behavior that's very sensitive to context. There are brain circuits that modulate the incoming pain signals, that signal comes in through primary afferent neurons into the spinal cord and ascends up through thalamus to be perceived as pain. But there's a feedback system, so there's a detector system and there's a feedback system. And the feedback system descends from the brain, through the midbrain, through the periaqueductal gray, through areas in the medulla and the pons, such as locus coeruleus and rostroventral-medial medulla, that feed back to the spinal cord to inhibit the transmission of that message. We've been very interested in this projection from locus coeruleus to spinal cord. because we think it's involved in altering the gain of pain transmission. And to do that, we've evolved some techniques using viral vectors to express specific actuator proteins in subsets of neurons, and we can then selectively activate or inhibit those subsets of neurons. If we do that for the noradrenergic neurons in the locus coeruleus projecting to the spinal cord, as opposed to the ones projecting to the forebrain, then we can influence the behavior of, in this case, a rat with a neuropathic pain injury. And depending on which subset of neurons we activate, and this is a cartoon slide that summarizes 10 years of work, more or less. If we activate those spinally projecting neurons, we can produce an analgesic effect. We improve the behavioral affect of the animal, and we reduce spontaneous pain. In effect, we've produced a synthetic analgesic state by activating a few hundred neurons. And if we activate the same type of neuron, but this time the ones that project to the frontal cortex, we actually worsen the affect of the animals and we increase their spontaneous pain behavior. So we've made their pain experience worse. We've given them a synthetic bad day. And that's a very informative experiment, but of course, which leads to a whole lot of questions. But one important one is, can we identify and manipulate this sort of circuitry in humans? And so we've been investing quite a lot of effort in doing this in recent years, and this has involved functional MRI imaging in the lamented Crick Bristol Imaging Centre. This involves giving a thermal stimulus to these subjects and getting them to do a task. And the task involves spotting the number 5 in a stream of letters. Hopefully you saw that and that was relatively easy. But it can be made hard, and the difficulty can be titrated according to your ability to be either easy or hard. So we have an experimental design where we either apply a low or a high thermal stimulus, not painful, and have subjects do either an easy task or a hard task at the same time. You can see that the high pain stimulus produces a higher pain report, the higher thermal stimulus. You can also see that there's a very small delta, about 10% in the pain score when the subjects are doing the hard task. This is our key into the circuitry. We can now study those two conditions, the contrast between easy and hard task, and ask, how is that mediated? If we look in the brain, we see some very common areas that are activated either by the high thermal stimulus, a pain network, if you will. We can also see activation and engagement in a visual attention network. However, when we look for the areas that show the interaction between those two inputs, the thermal stimulus and the attention task, we find that in the locus coeruleus in the brainstem. I was very suggestive that the locus coeruleus is involved in mediating this, but actually it's far from causal, it's association. So we repeated this study with 57 subjects. The first study was with 20 subjects. That gives us more power. And now we can resolve the areas of activation in the brainstem with greater fidelity. We can now see that there's a correlation between the analgesic effect and the activity in locus coeruleus, suggesting more strongly that it's involved. We can also, and this is the work of Valeria Oliver, a PhD student, we can also put together a connectivity map and see how those connections between frontal cortex, midbrain, and brainstem interact and are changed under the context of this experiment. We've also repeated that in fibromyalgia subjects, expecting that this mechanism would be dysfunctional In fact, it's not. If we adjust the task appropriately for them, then they can exhibit the same analgesic effect. We've also gone on to do a pharmaco-fMRI study of this phenomenon, this time using antagonists to opiates and a noradrenaline reuptake inhibitor to see how that influences the interactions in this circuitry. This time adding the additional challenge of imaging the spinal cord and looking at the activation of the spinal cord. There's a gap between a promising preclinical compound, and actually the compound is still very promising, but turning it into a clinically proven therapy is very challenging. Which leads me on to the next topic, which is how to close that translational gap. And as some of you will know, Lilly recently closed their UK Neuroscience Research Centre at Earl Wood. However, that's had the upside that Lilly has translocated some of its research activity into the University of Bristol, and specifically to this IMI pain care study, which is looking for functional pain biomarkers. And the objective of this work package, which is an EU work package, is to try and make better links between rodent models and human models of pain, such that pharmacokinetic studies and pharmacodynamic studies of putative analgesics can be better interpreted. And so there's a number of assays being used. This one is threshold tracking of electrical nerve stimulation with recording either in spinal cord or in EEG or in fMRI studies. And the aim is to improve translation. Another type of study that we've been involved in recently is looking at laser-evoked potentials, and these can be done both in humans and in rodents. And in rodents, you can record both the withdrawal response to the laser stimulus and also the EEG response to the stimulus. You can see that a known analgesic reduces the amplitude shown in red here of the EEG response, and that shows a relationship to the measured tapentadol dose given to the animals. This is important because it's translating both across humans and rodents and showing the dependency of the marker on the levels of the drug. And the objective overall for both industry and academics is to aim to increase the chance of a happy ending on a tube encounter, as shown here in sliding doors. Now, I don't want to give the impression that all of pain is in the brain. There are people in our research group that are believing that it's very much originating in the primary afferents, and I'm one of them. And these are very interesting group of neurons that transduce noxious stimuli and turn them into action potentials, and have some very specific and interesting properties. Now, Jim Dunham, who's a lecturer in phys pharm and neuroscience and a clinician, has a lot of experience from his PhD of recording from rodent peripheral nerves and looking at the impact of stimulation on the responses of C fibers and A delta fibers, these nociceptive fibers. Using those sorts of approaches, you can make some very clear inferences about the mechanism involved in generating sensitization and pain in, for example, osteoarthritis. Can you do something similar in humans? Well, there is a technique called microneurography where you put a tungsten microelectrode into a nerve. One of the very few times you can actually make a recording of single human neurons. However, this is a challenging, low-yielding approach, which requires some patience and dedication from both experimenter and also subject. Jim has the necessary patience and dedication and seems to be able to persuade people to volunteer their limbs for this purpose. This is Jim here, who's developed some approaches to try and improve the yield using ultrasound location to guide his needle into the nerve. And this shows his plot of the time it takes him to get a nerve recording using ultrasound or not using ultrasound. So this is a step forward. He's also worked with Anna Sales in our group to develop open access methods in order to open source methods to do this sort of technique, improving its generalizability and making it cheaper to do. He's wanting to take this on a step further using a tungsten electrode. You record from typically 1 or 2 neurons at a time. And of course, in brain studies, multi-site recordings are very much in the current state of play. Can we do this in peripheral nerves? Well, we've been funded to try and work up an approach to do this by Versus Arthritis, collaborating with people in Newcastle to try and see whether we can use multi-site recordings in peripheral nerves. And this is something that we've established proof of concept of in animal work and are looking to roll into human studies in the coming year. But what about genes, I hear you say? Surely there are genetic risk factors for pain, and perhaps we can find them through gene-wide association studies. But this is challenging because pain is a very multidimensional and poorly specified trait. Studies that have tried to use GWAT have not really produced the sorts of hits that we would expect based on our knowledge of mechanisms. So Jim's trying to take advantage of the ALSPAC cohort, which have been phenotyped and genotyped extensively, this Bristol birth cohort, and you can recall on the basis of genotype and look at specific candidate genes and do detailed pain phenotyping of those subjects and ask the question whether predicted changes in gene expression profile affects their pain report. During the COVID period, this study has had to adopt some interesting and novel approaches. And one of these has been taking pain testing out to the ALSPAC community in a modified burger van, which has caused the researchers some stress and anxiety, but has been very well received by the ALSPAC community. Can we do anything more with this very valuable Bristol-based resource? Well, as this birth cohort age, pain becomes more common in them. And that presents us with an opportunity. And there's currently a bid pending to the Advanced Pain Discovery platform that's been launched by the Medical Research Council and Versus Arthritis. This has been led by Bath with a psychosocial focus, but Rachel Goodman-Hill and a number of researchers here in Bristol are very much involved in this proposal and hoping to take advantage of the ALSPAC resource. Finally, and to return to the starting point, this idea of preventing acute pain transitioning into chronic pain, specifically in the case of post-herpetic neuralgia. There was a study published in '97, a single author randomized controlled trial of 80 patients, which held out the tantalizing possibility that giving amitriptyline, a noradrenergic reuptake inhibitor, might prevent the development of post-herpetic neuralgia. I've known about this study for 20 odd years. Nobody's replicated this study. Nobody's tried. And then the NIHR HTA program put out a call saying they would like somebody to assemble a team to try and see whether this is actually an effective preventative strategy. And I was delighted when Matt Ridd, who's an academic GP in the university, stepped forward to say, actually, I'd like to try and bid for this. It was like all of my Christmases had come at once. And we also were fortunate in that within region, Bob Johnson is something of a doyen of the post-herpetic neuralgia world. He's published extensively on it. And so we have assembled a good team to bid for this project, and we're fortunate to be awarded the funding for it. The bell says that my time must be up. I'm going to stop there. Catherine, my apologies. But my final point is that we're in a good position within the region to do this sort of pain work, this sort of translational work, in part because of the researchers that are here, but also in part because of the patient groups and facilities that are here. Thank you. Stop there.
Thanks very much, Tony. And with apologies, Matt had to leave early. I hope everyone saw this chat message. He had another meeting he had to attend. So because we're rapidly running out of time, we're just 2 o'clock now. Does anybody have any questions? Instead of putting it in the chat, just please unmute yourselves and shout any questions out for Tony and or Candy now. I'll give you 10 seconds. And if I don't hear anything, I will say thank you very much to both of our speakers. Anybody? Any takers? Customers, anybody? I guess not. Clearly, you're both extremely good speakers who have answered everybody's questions prior to them even thinking that they wanted to ask it. So thank you very much, Tony and Candy. And, and apologies for all the drilling next door. Thank you to everybody who came today, and we hope to see you at the next BN webinar, and you'll be advised of it through the next mailing. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to end this webinar now. Thank you.